This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today's guest has his PhD in biostatistics from the University of Southern California, has almost 30 years experience in healthcare data analytics, has worked for huge companies such as United Health Group, Kaiser Permanente, and Bayer Pharmaceuticals. Please welcome Chief Analytics and Data Science Officer at Health Catalyst, Jason Jones. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to jump right in. What is one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I hope you'll let me take two because I feel like they're coupled.
Absolutely.
So thing one is we actually have a problem. Human beings, it turns out, are not particularly good at taking data and drawing the correct conclusions. So we can offer people great data. We can stick them in awesome visuals like donut charts now instead of pie charts or basic time series line charts. And reliably as human beings, we will make predictable errors in interpretation and drawing conclusions. So that's thing one, is we just need to know that. Thing two is we can fix it. There are known solutions that we can apply to help people draw more correct, consistent, and transparent insights from the data that we provide them. So if we only had the problem and not a solution, this could be a very different discussion around like, oh, geez, like we've identified a disease, but there's no pill or drug or procedure to fix it. Bummer, but at least we know what the disease is. In this case, we have a diagnosis and we have the medication procedure to address it, and it's underutilized. So let's see if we can't help people take advantage of what's out there.
Tell me a bit more about what the solution is.
Sure. So let's start with describing the problem a little bit better. So if you are trying to draw just kind of basic insight and conclusion to take action based on data, probably the most standard one is just a time series line chart. What's our performance by day, by week, by month, by quarter, whatever it is over time? Let's see where we are. And if you're going to try to use those data to drive a decision, the four things that you would need to know are: what's our current performance? Without that, we're lost. You need to know in history, are there any isolated extreme data points, which could either be an indication of a data quality or anomaly issue, or it could be an indication of, hey, something was really different for that time period, whatever it was. You need to be able to identify if there were persistent and sustained periods of change in performance. And most importantly, because all of that is looking in the rearview mirror, good for understanding, but we can't change the past. The only thing we can change is the future. So the fourth thing is, if nothing changes, where do we expect to be in some relevant time period? This could be a week out if we're talking about staffing decisions. It could be a month out. It could be a year out. It depends on the decision that we're trying to drive, but we need to understand where do we think we're going to be, because if we're happy with that, then we just need to make sure that we keep doing whatever we're doing to get there. If we're not happy with it, we need to ask ourselves, what are we going to do differently? And if we're surprisingly happy with it, then we may have a question of how do we spread that to other places if it's not everywhere. So those are the four basic things. Where are we? Any extreme points in history, any sustained changes in history, and then where are we going? And what would you guess, now that we've done this across literally hundreds, like over 500 people, we've done this with junior analysts up through board members of organizations. What percentage of people would you estimate can get the right answer to those four questions presented with a reasonable line chart?
Very low. I'd guess single digits.
Wow, you're the first person to get that right. It's about 5%. 4 to 5% of people. And kind of like sobriety testing, what's not a good, so there's no, it's not correlated with experience. And the sobriety testing, it's actually totally uncorrelated with your confidence in your general analytic ability or whether you think you got the answers right or not. So not only are we as human beings not good at drawing the correct conclusions from data, but we actually are not aware that we're not good at it. And if we worry that we're not good at it, that doesn't protect us any more than being confident that we're brilliant. And we have a long history of this. I mean, the history of forecasting competition goes back decades now. And one of those competitions specifically pitted world experts in forecasting and subject matter experts against basic time series forecasting techniques that you probably have studied. And guess what won? It wasn't the people. Does that mean we don't have a role? No, we have a huge role, especially in healthcare. Nothing happens without people, and it's all about people. So people are critical. But also, like in healthcare, if we take a glass of water and pour it on the floor, on a linoleum covered hospital floor, we know it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time, right? Someone is going to slip and fall in that hospital. They're likely going to, break a leg, break a hip, do some other kind of damage. But we know what's going to happen, and therefore we take simple steps to wipe it up. I don't see us taking those simple steps reliably when it comes to helping humans make better decisions with the data that they have. We've spent a lot of time getting people data, far less time helping them make sure that they're using it correctly to actually drive the best decisions they can.
At the risk of being in the 95% here,
I am. So at least we'll be together.
we all are. So it's drawing an interesting connection to a place that is, I would say, hopefully very different from healthcare, which is the financial sector. So if you look at money managers, so people that, if you got lots of money, you give it to this person, they're supposed to go off and make you more of it, and they're supposed to do a good job of it.
Right. Which is measured by the size of their yacht, right?
Yeah.
Just so we're clear on how we would know if they were successful. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
If you look at there was a study that was done that looked at a bunch of these money managers, and it said, okay, how many of these people beat their benchmark? Right. So, for example, for those who might not be familiar with the financial industry, there are a lot of different benchmarks. People have different objectives when they invest their money. So, like, if somebody trades in securities like stocks and companies, right, they would have kind of one benchmark, right? Like maybe one of the indices. So, NASDAQ, Dow Jones, things like that. However, somebody else that trades in real estate, they would have a different benchmark. But let's just say for all of these money managers, we compare them against their benchmark. Okay, what percentage beat the benchmark? Well, it's actually, decent, like low double digits. I think it's like 20 something percent. However, what percentage of those people beat the benchmark after fees, right? So as as you had mentioned with their yachts and everything like that. In that case, it goes right down same low single digits. And what's interesting is that it each year, if you look at that, it changes which person beat the benchmark after fees. So what that tells us is that even when you have someone exactly like you mentioned who does a really fantastic job one year, it kind of feels a little bit like luck if we look at the data. So if we draw the same conclusion about this, it kind of also seems like you mentioned, right? Like that 5% of people that was able to, accurately look at that and draw the right outcome. I wonder if it would be the exact same population of people every single time they do it, or if it's just dumb luck.
Yeah. I don't know if it's dumb luck. I mean, I think what you're describing with the money managers is kind of the core of why we struggle just as human beings, we're stellar pattern matchers. That's what we do. That's how we've survived over hundreds of thousands of years, by quickly being able to recognize patterns and then figure out how to act accordingly. And most of the time, if you think you've detected a pattern and you turn out to be wrong, you're not the worse for it. Oh, I think that's a lion. Let me run away. If you're wrong, you're a little out of breath, your heart's in a little better shape. It's not a big deal. If you fail to detect the pattern, you're dead. And as kids, I think if we haven't done it ourselves, we've certainly seen it in movies. You lie in a grassy field, you look up at the clouds, and you see dragons, and you see flags, and you see all kinds of things out there. We are fantastic. We're designed to find patterns, whether they're there or not, and to act accordingly. Which I don't know if you've followed much from Deming, but he turned this into kind of a negative phrase and thought, and I'm going to use the word manager, but not money manager. He said, export anything to a friendly nation except U.S. management. And the reason for that is tied to what you're saying, but it's also tied to why, as human beings, we tend to do poorly with data where we don't have assistive interpretation, because we see patterns that are not there and we act on them. And guess who gets promoted into management positions? People who are action oriented.
Hmm.
A mentor of mine once said, who happened to be a physician, don't just do something, stand there. But can you imagine trying to hire a manager on LinkedIn by saying, we're looking for someone who doesn't overreact? We probably wouldn't see that. We for sure wouldn't see, we're looking for someone who has a bias against action. We absolutely will see, in the 95%, we want to hire someone biased to action. And so we're seeing lions around every corner, dragons in every cloud. And when we act, especially in health and healthcare, this usually means, to go back to your money manager, this means a direct increase in cost. We're going to implement a new program. We're going to use a new drug. We're going to use a new device. We're going to add, we're going to add, we're going to add. That's what we do. And that comes at a cost. It comes at a cost directly financially, because premiums go up, even if you're healthy. It hits you directly if you have to use the services, because your copays are going to be higher now than they were a couple of decades ago. And it hits us indirectly because we're constantly trying to find the latest, greatest, newest way to escape the lion or the dragon. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't seek improvement. We absolutely should. But we need to do so in the context of understanding the downsides of our superpower pattern matching capabilities as human beings.
So let me take this a step back. Let's say we have some curve that we care about that we're looking at, right? Like your kind of standard time series line chart.
Mm-hmm.
When you were describing those four things, kind of current performance, historical performance, the thing that struck me as a data guy as being the hardest to determine from just looking at that line chart and trying to extrapolate that into the future was around the whether they're short term or long term, what we'll call outliers. So the things in history which should not be considered indicative. of the future. You had mentioned kinda, okay, were there sustained periods of performance change? Were there, short periods of performance change, outliers, whatever? What recommendation do you have for someone like me that makes analytics for people to highlight those so that the proper conclusion can be drawn with a higher rate of success?
Yeah. So let's first just break it down into categories of problems because we're focused on the first one where if we think about, sort of vision as an analogy, where we are right now is basic spectacles or perhaps bifocals. We'll then have things like X-ray, and then we'll have things like functional MRI. And the difference between those things is like, if you have a vision impairment, you put glasses on now, you can see the thing that you couldn't see before more clearly. You maybe could see it before, but it was fuzzy or something.
Mm,
We go to X-ray, and you can now see something that you couldn't have otherwise seen without great effort. If you have a broken arm, you can either just guess where the fracture is and how bad it is. You can slice the person's arm open and take a look. Probably not optimal. Um, or you can use X-ray. And then the third part, functional MRI, is applied to areas where even if you were to slice open my skull, you could not actually see the use of oxygen and sugar in different regions of the brain being used to interpret your face, something outside the window or something else. So there's three different levels, and that's important because we're just focused on can we at least give people glasses when they can't
mm.
see? Like when we start to turn 50 or 60, people tend to need reading glasses. Can we give them reading glasses? So let's just be clear about that. So then how do we do that piece? Because there are other levels we can progress to, but let's just make sure which level we're at. So if we're in the space of giving people the equivalent of reading glasses or some other basic eye correction, statistical process control, been around over 100 years, does a great job of identifying individual outlying points versus shifts, persisted shifts in performance over time. Since the invention of the statistical process control chart, which is, circa 1910, we have had wonderful advances in computing that now do automated change point detection. And we'll specifically look, you have 60 different techniques you can choose from to apply in the back end to say, help separate an isolated change from a persisted change. And it could be a change in level, it could be a change in trend, whatever. Doesn't matter. We have techniques to address it. When we think so let's just pause there for a moment. But both of those are techniques that are readily available. What we have not seen as someone in your profession and mine as well is how easy is it to integrate that into a standard BI tool? Because that's what most people use, right? Historically, I mean, Excel is still, I think, the most common BI tool out there, but Power BI, Tableau, others, ClickSense, they exist. And we can integrate. Unfortunately, those vendors are not doing a great job of integrating these tools directly into what they offer, but they do provide mechanisms for being able to do so. And that's great. So we can now scale the ability for someone to be able to have not just a line chart, but a line chart that puts a red dot where we have an extreme outlier, highlights here's where there's been a persistent change in performance, forecasts out here's where you're going to be in some relevant time period, a day, a week, a month, a quarter, whatever it is. So all of those can now be embedded into standard BI tools, and that's great because that's the equivalent of like, yeah, I can tell that I can't see your face right now versus, oh, when I put some reading glasses on and now I can see your face and I'm fine. Why not just do that? We can.
Yeah, yeah. I, at the risk of sounding a little glib,
Hmm.
I think this is a marketing problem. What I mean by that is you have a degree in biostatistics, right? That contains a thorough and deep understanding of not just the applications in biology, but of statistical theory.
Although I'll point out, I did not learn about statistical process control, change point detection, or forecasting. Like we never touched on them in my
Wow.
entire undergraduate and graduate career. And actually, it wasn't until I moved to Bayer,
Yeah.
healthcare pharmaceuticals, where I had the opportunity to learn any of those techniques, which was interesting. But anyway, we'll put that to the side.
Yeah, no, it is funny how, uh, the office is, very much a classroom.
Yeah.
Um, my background is in pure mathematics, so, I mean, I was required to take, like a stats class and, like, a programming for stats class, but I did not dive super deep into it. Again, that was something that I learned in the office classroom. I do wonder how much the market knows, number 1, this is as prevalent of a problem as it is. And number 2, that it is as simply solvable as here's a framework, run this framework on the things that you put in front of people. So hopefully we're doing our job by putting that out there today. One of the things that is interesting about what you said is you were talking about this bias for action
Hmm.
concept and where on the spectrum between do nothing and do everything we should be. Obviously, extremes are typically never good, and switching our brain to heuristic mode and just being like, I'm going to do 50% of the actions that come into my head. So like obviously there's like a little wiggle room and, depending on the day and the situation that moves. There was an interesting mental framework. Um, I'm sure it has been out there from people before, but where I was first introduced to it was Jeff Bezos did a podcast, and on the podcast, he was talking about his decision making process and how he tries to guide the decisions that are undertaken at Amazon. And he talks about the difference between what he calls one way decisions and two-way decisions. So, a two-way decision is a decision where if I make this decision and I'm wrong, the cost to change it is very acceptable. A one way decision is obviously the opposite. Once we decide to make this decision and take action, the cost to change that decision is very high or impossible. It strikes me that the healthcare industry is an industry that contains a much higher percentage of one way decisions compared to two-way decisions, right? If I go and I'm like, we got to amputate, right? That is the definition of a one-way decision. So being in that industry, I think provides you with a unique perspective to talk a little bit more about identifying which decision type this is. And I think a two-way decision should have that bias for action and a one-way decision should not. Talk to me a little bit about how someone can identify which class of decision they're in and then how they should act.
Okay. So you might not love this, but as you were talking, I was saying, actually, the bigger challenges most of the time that we face in healthcare actually are two-way decisions. And that's what's killing us.
Say more.
Yeah. So you mentioned the amputation.
Mhm.
Um, so who makes the decision to do or not do an amputation?
That's hopefully with informed consent. The patient who's been thoroughly informed makes a good decision there, but I don't you tell me.
Yeah, I mean the patient will have some say, but it's and certainly can always go against medical advice. But we would typically, and as a patient, I think before I made a decision to amputate or not amputate, whether it be a toe or a leg, I would seek the guidance of a surgeon or some other specialist.
Sure. Yeah.
And that person to get to that role needs to go through college. They need to go through 4 years of medical school. They need to go through fairly extensive residency program. For a surgeon, it's going to be longer. Quite often they'll go through fellowship. Typically, have been practicing 10 years in their specialty, which is increasingly a subspecialty. If it's not a traumatic amputation, meaning if it's not that, you just got hit by a bus, or you have an infection that has gone gangrenous and is actually life-threatening at this point, you may not even be, as the patient, able to make the decision, perhaps because you're attached to a mechanical ventilator or something at this point.
Sure.
So if we take the non-emergent cases out of it and you have time, but even in those emergent cases, it's usually not a single provider who makes the decision. That provider will often consult with several other people in both directions. Consult with trainees. What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? Consult with specialists in other areas. How could we think about the circulatory damage that may be the root cause here in a different way? Is there another way to spare the limb that we're not thinking of, that the surgeon for himself may be less aware of because they're maybe not necessarily experts in the underlying disease processes that are leading us to this decision point? And will often confer with direct peers in the specialty or even people senior to that individual. So we think about it, and there are some cases where it's like, ooh, the person's bleeding out, or is it imminent risk of death because of this horrific infection or something like that. There absolutely are those decisions that have to be made, but very, very rarely is it a single expert provider making that decision in isolation. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is if you think about where we're struggling with health and healthcare, it often is in the space of management, leadership, and policy decisions, many of which may feel one way at the time, but they're not. They're, adding yet another care management program. They're making a decision about whether to put or not put or take a medicine off of a formulary, which is what providers are allowed to use when they prescribe medications, either, to manage your blood pressure or in the hospital to try to take care of an infection or pain or something else. So most of the decisions are actually two-way decisions, meaning they can be changed later. But the aspect that I'm pointing out here as part of the challenge is that we don't revisit those decisions. It's not whether the decision is actually two-way as a decision. It's whether we go back and ask ourselves, was this the right decision, and do we reverse it? Now that is a psychology and marketing problem, because to do that, you have to go in and say, oh, shoot, I made this decision with the best of intent, and it turns out I was wrong. And now we need to undo my decision. That's hard. That's hard.
Yeah.
And that's what we're asking people to both get in front of by being able to leverage the data that we have better, but also on the back end to ask ourselves, and this is when we get more into the kind of functional MRI type of analysis, because it's a lot harder to do that back end. Was this decision the right decision? Especially when it's a strategic or policy level decision. Much, much harder, much harder. But how often do we do it? So I guess what I'm suggesting, Ryan, is that it's less about truly in health and healthcare is it a type 1 versus type 2 decision. Is it a reversible or non-reversible decision? But are we actually evaluating ourselves and reversing our decisions? And what I see too often is that we don't. We just add something else on top of it, and then something else on top of that. And those are the things that add to complexity, fragility, harm, and cost.
Mm.
And that's when it shifts from a purely academic, philosophical discussion that we can write about in textbooks to an econometric and moral decision because it starts to impact people's lives, where we get to the point where healthcare becomes an independent risk factor for health because of the stress.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you got up this morning and your health was fine. I hope you are not facing medical debt. I hope that you are not in a position anytime soon where you have to go to an emergency department or for that matter, even a primary care provider and make a decision where you find yourself saying, I think such and such might be the right way to go, but I can't afford it. And if I take that option, it will independently cause me stress. And that stress will adversely impact my health. And that's where we've gotten to. So again, we have type 1 and type 2 decisions, but for me, most decisions are in fact reversible. We don't do what we should first to make the best decision. And then secondly, and at least as importantly, to revisit the decision that was reversible and actually contemplate reversing it.
Wow. I found that clear, prescriptive, and terrifying. But I also have to admit, as an outsider and a hopefully low use consumer,
Hmm.
it makes me very happy to hear that there are those within the healthcare industry that are thinking this way. You touched in your answer on psychology, which obviously you have background in undergrad and your master's. Over the course of the podcast, we've talked a bit about, the biases and the heuristic thinking patterns that humans engage in. That clearly has helped to formulate the perspective that you bring. What lessons can you pass along to the listeners from that background and that education to help us draw better conclusions with a higher rate of success?
So Ryan, that's an interesting one because I really do wake up each morning and say, how can I help be part of the solution? If we think about value or ROI, it's benefit divided by cost. How can I be part of the benefit? How can I be part of the numerator in value and ROI, at least to the degree that I'm part of the denominator and hopefully more the cost? I think a piece of what I've tried to bring forward is that in some circumstances, people need to experience things for themselves, in both the problem and the solution, before they are able to change. And we need change. And so I have invested in being able to demonstrate some of the principles that you learned about in your math stats classes in ways that will help people understand both that there's a problem and that there's a solution. And to be able to experience that directly so that they might be willing to act. It hasn't worked out to the degree that I would like so far. and I keep seeking ways to change that. Um, I wish I could say, yeah, you know what? This was a problem that we had 10 years ago and we solved it. We're now making better decisions in healthcare with data. The reality is what I've watched is the reason that I went into the pharmaceutical industry in the mid 1990s is because I saw within the for-profit pharmaceutical industry a willingness in the action of making better decisions with data and then acting upon them, realigning entire sales forces by looking at how market share and volume was changing in a drug product. It's like, wow, because what I see in the provider and payer space, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing opinions. I'm seeing people routinely throw out good data and good methods and make predictably poor decisions and not revisiting them. Why is it? What does it take in the pharmaceutical industry? Why are they taking an alternate path? If you think about marketing and you maybe you would have been a little bit on the young side, but can you imagine running TV commercials for erectile dysfunction 30 years ago? Like that, like that was so, don't go there, can't touch it, embarrassing, run away. Now, like we have these commercials on TV, we have for decades, and they've actually driven huge sales and monumental revenue and profit. Viagra and others are household names now. So we have shown that we can take topics that are uncomfortable, that nobody wants to talk about, that nobody wants to admit, but when we have a solution, which we did finally have a viable solution, right? There were solutions for erectile dysfunction before Viagra. They were just horrible, right? They Caberject, and just by the name, if you don't know what that is, that just doesn't bring up warm, fuzzy feelings in your mind just by the name. It's just really unpleasant, mechanical devices and things like that. When you could just take a pill to address the need, all of a sudden we were willing to talk about it. And so, Ryan, what I have been doing is trying to create that type of pill for driving better decisions with data. What I haven't been able to do, what maybe you thought I would have been able to do with a psych background and a marketing background, is to then turn that into massive utilization of the tools. And we're just not seeing it. I'm not seeing it yet. And I wish I knew. And if you have ideas or some of the people viewing this podcast have ideas of how can we help people now that we have a problem and we have a solution and we're not adopting it? Why? And Ryan, I don't know if you know this, but Viagra is actually a derivative of an antihypertensive. It was originally studied as an antihypertensive, right? We still have a problem with high blood pressure control medication adoption and adherence, right? Because it's much easier to sell and market to a population where they have immediate recognition, immediate misery, and immediate turnaround once they put the solution in place. And with blood pressure, you take a pill today to prevent vascular damage that could lead to kidney damage or a heart attack or a stroke or an amputation, as we started with. But 10 or 20 years from now, not now. With Viagra, you take it now and you're done. It works. Problem solved. And I think a piece of it is that we have not helped people approach better decision making with data with a reasonable framework. It may be over marketing. Like if you go out and look at BI and AI out there in the world, it's real. Like people just throw those terms around. People throw data literacy around. They throw analytics around, and we don't actually take the time to say, what are we talking about? And so if you can't have a meaningful conversation about what we're talking about, and you and I share, when you say analytics and I say decision or something, if we don't have a common understanding of what those terms mean, it's very difficult to identify problems and address them. That may be at the root of it. I don't know, Ryan. I wish I knew. I have beliefs. I've cycled through beliefs. I've acted on those beliefs, and still I see these tools like that very effective blood pressure medication sitting in the medicine cabinet, still sitting back at the pharmacy, still sitting back in the pharmacy warehouse because we're not taking the thing that we know has been demonstrated to deliver benefit. And I don't know. I'd be really interested what your thoughts are on how to identify and then address the issue.
Well, I would start by saying that I'm likely wholesale underqualified. But since you asked, a lot of the things that you were talking about, um, like the immediacy of pain or reward, um, and indirectly talking about incentives are ideas that I heard a lot um, on the Freakonomics podcast. I'm a huge Freakonomics fan. I say this every time I mention them, but if either of the Steves over at Freakonomics hear this, I would love to have you on. Um, but the ideas that they talk about are in this field of behavioral economics. Which when people hear economics, they think money, but it's really the study of incentives, particularly behavioral economics, is essentially the study of how and why do people act in ways that appear to be in direct contradiction to their incentives,
Yeah.
right? Like, hey, not having a heart attack sounds awesome. All you got to do, just take this pill. And it's like, nah. So they study quite a bit of these kind of phenomenal situations where people are doing things that don't seem to be in their best interest. Over the course of the podcast, there are a handful of things that they talk about as showing progress towards solving some of these problems. I would argue that there are many manifestations of this kind of behavioral economic strange behavior out of humans, and that it dictates a tool set versus an individual tool. But one of the things that I liked the most was there was this concept that they called nudging. So Richard Thaler wrote a book called Nudge, and it's all about what are little actions that we can take that use our own psychological biases against us to get us to be compliant with things which are actually in line with our incentives. And there were actually a handful of government nudge units that were set up where they found silly things like just sending a letter out that say, 97% of taxpayers pay their taxes on time.
Yeah.
Got people to pay their taxes on time.
Yeah. Auto enrolling in retirement is another example.
Absolutely.
Like
Yep.
that's frequently stated. Yeah.
So it strikes me that that concept and those tool sets are the things that I'm most familiar with that could be brought to task with this problem. But ultimately, like you mentioned, it really just does come down to having conversations one at a time, right? We're just humans. We get a series of people that get put in front of us every day, and those are the places where we get to make impact. And hopefully, over a lifetime, that sum total tallies up to something significant. Um, but I can certainly say in my own consulting relationships, with folks. I get brought in to help with, whether it's, the visualization and reporting end or kind of the, back end and infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. I try constantly to focus on like, hey, here's the, be kind to your future self, make these decisions easy and digestible. But I will say that there are a lot of incentives at work around speed, complexity versus completeness, unfortunately politics, office politics, not, government politics. Um, all of those things I think make the waters muddy. So it's up to people like you and I to distill out the information and provide it in a format that is psychology friendly, shall we say.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm curious how many people you run into in your life, do you think, who have deferred getting reading glasses a couple of years, maybe for vanity, not necessarily physical appearance so much as the acknowledgement of aging. There could be a host of reasons.
Yeah.
Um, do you know anybody? Is there anyone you can think of in your life where you're like,
Me. So it wasn't so much reading glasses. I have contacts in right now, but I have astigmatism and my vision was uh bad, unpassably bad for certain things, right? Like I could see good enough. Like I played sports. Like I was a lacrosse goalie and that's like a fast moving ball and
yeah,
I honestly was never very good. I never really tried super hard, but I could at least like see the ball and see people and all that stuff. So it was like it was passable, but it was like right on the line of passable. Um I got the glasses when I was young, and when I was young, it was like, "Oh, this is like new. This is a novelty." But then, like within a couple years, when the novelty had worn off, and then especially as I like got older, was much more interested in appearance and interpersonal, all that stuff. Like I wouldn't wear my glasses in school, and I'd be like trying to see the board stuff. My teachers were like, "Dude, I can see that you can't see. Like you need to wear your glasses." And I was like, like so I was totally non-compliant, gave myself like strain headaches every day at school because I was squinting to see things because I didn't want to wear my glasses. So here I am, you know. I'm your example.
so so now you're wearing contacts.
Yeah.
What what changed for you?
It's a funny story. I would say two things. One is hopefully as humans mature, we start to realize that like high school type pressure of what's everybody going to think of me for wearing glasses kind of evaporates, right? Just kind of like anybody that thinks poorly of me for wearing glasses, like I'm just kind of okay with that, right? Like that's a self healing issue. I just don't need to worry about. Um, the other funny reason, just to share a peek into my own neuroses, was I started consulting. And when I started consulting, I was in my, early to mid 20s. And technologically, I was very sound, but it was just infeasible for me to have at that point, or possibly even still today, like accrued a sufficient amount of experience and reps. So I'd be going in and I'm working with, like VPs and C-suite folks at Fortune 500 companies, and I'm this like 24-year-old kid that's coming in supposedly telling them how they should do things. So I would take any edge that I could to look a little bit older and look a little bit smarter. So I would wear my glasses there. So the needle went from one side to the other of like wanting to look less nerdy to wanting to look more nerdy, but it was all psychology.
Did you contemplate or actually dye your hair
That
gray?
I never did that. I never did that. But maybe I should have.
It's interesting. Um, I know a lot of people who have deferred that, and you might have touched on something in your answer. I don't know if you did it on purpose, but you said as with maturity, you start to focus you start to worry less about how people think about you. There comes a point in our lives where that actually goes the other way. People talk about senior moments, right? And now there's such a thing as exos maturity, I suppose. But I wonder if, in the case of analytics and specifically where we've been focused, can we, like, I've been in this business 20 years. Like, if I have to admit today that I can't interpret a line chart, what does that say about me?
Yeah.
I wonder if the maturity in this case might actually work against us. I don't know. Like, the more senior you are, somehow the less I should. In surgeons, we have the surgeon's checklist. But if there was anybody who would say, well, I don't need a checklist, it's going to be the person who's been an expert surgeon for 20 to 30 years, right? Because I mean, that
Yeah.
her experience without the checklist should mean that she doesn't need one in the future, maybe. So does the need for assistance actually, in this case, fight against us? Because you have to acknowledge that you have a problem.
I think it might. Jason, we've had the opportunity to learn a lot from you. I know I certainly had my mind expanded into new areas by just having the opportunity to hear some of your ideas. But I'd like to give the listeners an opportunity to learn about you. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you like to do outside of work and thinking about these problems?
Yeah, so I think we share at least one thing that we like to do outside of work. I actually two, I think, because you mentioned something else in passing. One is I like to ride a bike. Um, I would love to run. My knees stopped working a long time ago, so I switched to cycling, but I really enjoy that. And
Mhm.
what's maybe a little bit odd is what I like most is going up hills. And it's not because I
Glutton for punishment.
necessarily, yeah, I don't have a fear of going down the hill, but I find it meditative, actually. The breathing, the rhythm, the focus. So I really enjoy that. And the other thing, which, in high school, I took pride in, and for a little bit after, in not reading anything. Like, everyone tells me I have to read. They tell me what to read. I'm going to rebel. I'm not going to read, except where I have to, for school or whatnot. But now I really love reading. Nudge was a wonderful book. I've read it twice. And Freakonomics is a great podcast, but the that book is wonderful. And you talk about psychology, the foundation, a lot of the theoretical foundations for nudge and behavioral economics came from psychology. And
Mhm.
you know, the person who won the Nobel Prize in economics for the foundations of that work was actually a psychologist
Mhm.
who, talking about personal experience, failed to learn from his own research and estimating how long it would take to write a book about the topic. So we're a curious species, but I would say those are the two things. Then of course there's family, kids and grandkids, especially grandkids. Getting to see your kids do things that grandkids now that you could never do or do as well, and you get to watch them do it. It's just amazing. And the blessing to be able to see it up close. You can see it in other people, but when you get to watch somebody develop up close over a period of time and you just see what they can do, it's like, wow, that's amazing. And that's a great source of joy for me outside of work.
I love it. If anybody has liked what you had to say, wants to reach out, talk more, ask a question, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Um, well, I guess I think we found each other through LinkedIn.
Mhm.
Um, so that's probably a good way. If you look for, I mean, maybe we can post how to find me. I chose the wrong parents when it came to my name. Jason Jones is pretty common. You Google Jason Jones and you, you come up with a lot. But if you Google Jason Jones, the health catalyst, you'll find me pretty quickly. And yeah, I would, especially if people have ideas or if there's some way that people wonder if I might be able to help them, like you, this is my passion. It's my avocation. It's I perhaps delude myself into thinking this is supporting better decisions is how I can contribute to the world. And so it would be an honor and a pleasure if anyone felt that I might be able to help them. I certainly would try and be grateful for the opportunity.
I love it. Man after my own heart. Jason, this has been an invigorating and uplifting conversation. As I mentioned, hearing a person think the way that you do about the field that you're in is very exciting, gives me hope. And also, I took away a lot of ideas that I know I can bring with new vigor to my clients. So hopefully they all thank you as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Truly a pleasure, Ryan. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
I also, speaking of listeners, want to thank our listeners, especially if you made it this long. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure if you like this, tell a friend, give us a rating, like, subscribe, hopefully a good rating. All of that stuff, it really helps to spread the word and keep the podcast going. We really appreciate you listening. Jason, thank you again so much for coming on. This has been another exciting episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Thanks all for listening. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.